Authors Over 50, Writing in Life's Sweetest Third. Authors Over 50's weekly podcast celebrates writers and their journeys to publication. Writing after 50 is a whole story on its own, so let's skip to life's sweetest third and talk with authors about their journey from pen to publish. Welcome. I'm Julia Daly, your host, and I invite you to listen to interviews with writers who've achieved their goal of publishing a book just later in life. We've seen award lists for under 30 or under 40, but I've yet to see lists for those who've achieved a significant milestone of their own, launching a new career and publishing their first book after the age of 50. We will hear about these authors' inspirations, struggles, strategies, and the smell of that first book. These writers' journeys inspire me because I'm one of them. Earning Bachelor and Master degrees, my guest spent 29 years in classrooms, first teaching 7th grade language arts and social studies, followed by 22 years of high school English and psychology. Upon retirement, she joined a writing workshop where a good instructor taught her that the slash and burn of editing doesn't leave scars. She wrote 3 books in quick succession. She also writes essays and poetry. She spends time reading, writing, baking, and happily communing with nature in Wisconsin. Welcome to Authors Over 50, Mary Ann Noe.
Good morning, Julia. So good to see you.
Thank you, Mary Ann. Our opening question on Authors Over 50 is always, what took you so long to write your first book?
Well, I started out my very first book. It should have been, put in the garbage because it was a Bulwer Lytton. It was midnight and the church went bong, bong, bong. I was going to win the Pulitzer Prize for literature, but at the 4th bong, I quit. So I was about 8. Then I picked up again when I was teaching, mainly because my mother fed me this line and it rattled around in my brain for a number of years before I could actually formulate it. But the first line of A Handful of Pearls is, I learned to golf so I could smoke. Isn't that an incredible line?
That's a great line.
So, and eventually it evolved into that. And it took me about 10 years to write that, simply because I was teaching at the same time. And I didn't have a lot of time to write, and it didn't come very easily. I was on an airplane coming back from Los Angeles one time, sitting next to a lovely, very businesslike woman, quite a large woman, and you do the usual thing. How's the weather? Where are you going? And it's like she was my muse. I wish I knew who she was, because she pulled out her book and I pulled out my yellow legal pad and I started to write. And by the time I was back in Milwaukee, I had 16 handwritten pages, which was, and it just kind of went from there.
Well, that was a great airplane ride to find a muse to get started.
So I went from there, and developed some more.
Well, you didn't publish your first book until age 74, but you've been quite prolific ever since. So tell us about when you wrote that first book. How did you proceed? Did you search for an agent, decide to use a hybrid, a small press, or did you self-publish?
Well, with the first one I wrote, which is A Handful of Pearls, I decided that I would look for an agent, and I wanted to go kind of with the Stephen King model. He posts on his wall all the rejections he gets, and he started out, I think, with like 100 until he really got famous. So I thought, well, I'll shoot for 100 rejections, and I got up to about 60, and I thought, no. So I joined a writing workshop, and from there, and it's kind of a longer story, but I was able to publish. This was not the first one published, even though it was the first one written. The first one published was To Know Her, and it's about a high school girl. So I was teaching high school at the time, and I told my students I wanted to write a book about a normal teenager and with the normal challenges. And the biggest football player in the class stood up and cheered. And I thought, I'm on the right track. So between those two manuscripts, I had things kind of stockpiled a bit. I did try self-publishing. It was not very satisfying for me. So when I joined this writing workshop, the instructor is really, really good, and she's published 14 novels herself. So she helped me get the first one about the high school girl published. And then shortly after that, A Handful of Pearls about the woman who learned to golf so she could smoke. And I've just kind of gone on from there.
So were they self-published, or did you find a micro press or a hybrid?
I found a small press, an indie press. In fact, Black Rose Writing is in San Antonio, Texas, not too far from you. And they are very, very good. It's a traditional small indie publisher, so you don't pay anything unless you choose to do more marketing through them. So I've been very, very satisfied with that.
It's nice to have a partner in the business.
Exactly.
How did writing that first book change your process of writing?
Not much. I'm kind of a peripatetic writer. I write sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the evening. I can go for 2 weeks without writing, although that's kind of painful. I have a website with a monthly blog, so then I'm committed to doing that once a month. So that forces me. And then once a week, I'm still in the writing workshop, and 10 women and the instructor meet, and we go through things. Sometimes I bring in poetry. I just finished a murder mystery, and that one needs some work yet. So, it's still in the hopper kind of thing. So it didn't change my process so much. But I find that the promotion and the marketing takes more time and effort than the writing. You probably have discovered that yourself.
You are right about that. I think a lot of us fall down the rabbit hole of marketing and publicity and find it hard to get back to writing because we spend so much of our time marketing.
Yeah, that's true. But I have a brain that talks to me and says, no, you need to get this story down. You need to sit down and write. And because I'm blogging once a month and I still write a lot of poetry and, send that out and such. So there's a lot of I'm not one to stick with one thing. I write in several different genres. So I'm surprised I've been married for over 50 years because I don't stick with things real long.
Well, that's great. It keeps you energized.
That's right.
What do you think is the most challenging part of your artistic process?
It's not the writing. It's not the editing and the rewriting. I've learned to do that. But the hardest part is, as I said, I think the promotion. And I love talking to retirement communities. I love going to libraries. I love going to book festivals, but it is hard work. So, which I don't think a lot of readers realize.
No, and they can gobble up our books so quickly and wonder where the next one is, coming from. And they don't realize that we're doing all of this that it is a business and it's a full-time job.
And, another hard thing is the lack of feedback from readers. And I have gotten into the habit, if I like a book, I'll try and find the writer's webpage and just ship off a little comment. And you can put stars on Amazon and you can, write reviews and that kind of thing. That's so important to a writer to get some feedback to what they're doing. And it doesn't happen real often, even though readers may love what you're writing, and they tell me they do, with people that are here in town that have purchased my books and such. But I'd like to know more.
I think that's so vital to authors today. And I didn't realize until I became one. I loved all these books and I never wrote the author a note. And now I'm trying to be more committed to doing that because it is so important to us and it really does feed us.
Yes. And it doesn't take any kind of money. It just takes a few minutes and you've made a connection, and made somebody happy.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Well, what was your inspiration besides that one-liner that your mother gave you for writing that first book?
Well, the Handful of Pearls, it was that first book about learning, the first one I wrote, learning to play golf. And so she was kind of an inspiration. in that she had gone to a girls' school where if you wanted to smoke, you had to get out away from the nuns, and the only place was the farthest fairway. So they all signed up to learn how to play golf to get out there for Fayette. And then it just, even though the woman in the story is not her, it's an 84-year-old woman, and my mother was in her 80s at the time I was writing this. It's not her, but it just kind of bloomed by itself. Characters tend to grow in my head. My stories are very character driven, and they talk to me, which of course makes me schizophrenic, but I think all of us are that way if they're right.
I think so too. And I see my stories as if they're on a big screen. I can see what the characters are wearing and how they talk and what they eat. So I do think they take over the space in our head.
Yeah.
But how do you determine the plots of these books?
The one about the handful of pearls, I had to write an outline because it goes back and forth between Betty, who's the old woman, and her middle-aged daughter, Reggie. So each chapter is a different viewpoint. And it was like, okay, what's going to be the major conflict here? Well, Betty can't talk to her daughter, and she sees her daughter going through the same kinds of traumas she was. So I kind of lined up the kind of traumas that somebody living in the 30s and 40s before she was married, and then marriage and having children and stuff, but the kinds of things that she would run into. And then I paralleled that with Reggie in a more contemporary setting. So that book was much more structured. The one To Know Her, which is about the high school girl, she's in a coma as a result of a car accident. And I wanted to, I thought a little bit about, well, what are the challenges a high school girl has? Drugs, drinking, sex. I wanted to get all of that in there, friendship. And then but I didn't know how to do it because she's in a coma, and her parents, get all this stuff from her backpack from the car accident that she was in. They can't explain some of it. So I'm thinking in my head, well, what would she have in her backpack? And then building stories around that. But as I wrote, the parents started talking to me and telling me, you're going to have to tell our story too. And I said, no, this is a young adult book. I don't want to write about you. I want to write about Juliana, is the main character's name. And they said, well, if you don't put our story in there, because we're trying to decide whether to take life support away or not, this book is not going to work. So I did put, and it turned into a crossover novel, a YA and an adult novel. And it's been very successful. So that's kind of how they organically grow. The book that's coming out in March, which is Hannah's Eyes, is about a middle grade girl, and I wrote it as a Christmas present for our granddaughter. And it's kind of based on Midsummer Night's Dream, because she finds she steals her grandfather's spare glass eyeball, and she holds it up thinking, maybe she can see through it, but it pops onto her eye and takes her into a fairy world where the king and queen are at war, and the chaos is starting to slip into the human world. And so she grabs her best friend, Meg, and they go back to the fairy world to try and solve the problem. Well, that's kind of the king and queen are Oberon and Tatiana, I named her, which is right out of Midsummer Night's Dream. And the war between the king and queen is right out of Midsummer Night's Dream. But of course, from an 11-year-old's viewpoint, it's a whole different thing. But I do have Grandpa's eyeball. Would you like to see his eyeball?
Absolutely.
I was lucky to be at a book talk talking about this forthcoming book. And I said, I'm looking for an eye to take with me when I talk to groups. And one of the ladies said, that's what I do for a living. I make prosthetic eyes. So here
wow.
is Grandpa's eye.
Oh, love it.
Isn't that something?
Yes.
So she made me an eye.
That would be lovely around your neck.
Yeah. And it's it's hollow on the back.
Yeah.
So it's acrylic. It's really fun. It really is a hit when I talk about the book.
I bet it is. Not many people carry around a glass eye with them. So,
yeah, right.
and your story sounds so intriguing. So I think that's wonderful. I think you certainly had a rich environment to draw from, teaching for that many years, and all the students who came through.
Yes.
Did real people inspire any of those characters?
A lot of different people, and I can't even think of their names anymore, but, kids that would come back. Some freshmen one year went to a party over the holidays, and there was beer. And we had just talked about this on a Friday. What are you going to do? You got to plan ahead to that, to that, to that. And I taught humanities, and I taught in a Catholic school, so we could talk about all sorts of things. There were 4 boys, I think, 3 or 4. They came back Monday morning, and they said, explained that they had been at this party. And I said, so what did you do? And they said, it was guys. We left, and it was like 20 below that night. We went out and we called our dads, and we stood outside on the curbing and waited for them to come pick us up. And it's like, yes.
Well, you had a great influence there.
So that was kind of that played into one of the stories that's in To Know Her. So the things like that, that came up. Kids would talk to me, and I would, I'd never broke confidence, of course, but it was fodder for my brain.
Well, I just appreciate you so much, and all of our teachers. My mother was a teacher. I was a teacher. My daughter is an excellent teacher, and it's just amazing the influence you can have on young lives.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. It's wonderful. I love teaching.
We talked a little bit about this animal called publicity and marketing. Have you found anything that you think works for you, or maybe that didn't work?
Well, I'm lucky enough to have hired a publicist. And now she's in Ireland, which sounds kind of counterintuitive, but she used to live in Wisconsin, and she has an associate here in Wisconsin that handles things. But she's really very good. And I talked to one of the librarians when I went to a library recently, and said, I think, tell me now, if I had approached you as opposed to my publicist approaching you, would your attitude be different? And he said, yes. He said, because if you're professional enough to have a publicist working for you, he said that means something. So I found her to be a real bonus. So other than that, trying to get into schools is very, very difficult because, of course, and then they need to vet the books. I understand that. And as a teacher, there's so much that teachers have to do as it is. There isn't a lot of time to have an author come in and talk.
Was there any particular thing that your publicist has done that you thought really moved the needle any?
She does a lot of publicizing through bookstores and book festivals, and I've been to a couple of those, and that has been good. But what has been really fulfilling in both sales and personally is to visit retirement communities. And because they buy books for themselves, they buy books for their grandchildren, and they're interested in publishing and writing, and who you are and what you're doing, and it's just very, very uplifting, and it fills a fuel tank so I can keep going.
Well, that sounds lovely. I've never heard anybody say that they visited retirement communities before, so thank you for sharing that. Are there any specific books or seminars or writing retreats or groups that you think have improved your writing journey?
Oh, yes. The group I belong to is called All Writers, and she does work online and in person. It's allwriters.org, and she is wonderful. She has an MFA, which would be equivalent to a PhD in creative writing. She's very gentle. She'll say, do you really want to say that? Do you really want to use that word? And so then it brings you up, and we share. 10 of us get together every Wednesday afternoon for 2 hours, and we share 10 pages or less. And we don't always get to everybody, depending on what's out there, but every other week for sure. And that has been very, very helpful, both in poetry and in prose that I'm working on. And she sits down, she does charge for these kinds of things, but when you want to publish, then she'll sit down, help you write a query letter, help you write several different synopses, different lengths. She will put a list together of 10 publishers that she think would be very good. And then you put a list together, and then you get together and see if there are any overlaps. And then you start, pitching. And she did say to me, pitch to my publisher. She had changed publishers. Now she's back again with Black Rose, but she said, try him. And I said, can I mention your name? Absolutely. And that's what got me in. So it's like everything else. Sometimes it's who you know.
Well, that's a great recommendation for our listeners today. Allwriters.org.
Yes. And she has clients in Australia, Canada. She holds a retreat, in-person retreat every year for a week. And I've gone to one of those years ago. I should go to a few more because it's fun to sit down with other writers and see what they're doing and, get some ideas. And so it's other writers really, and writing workshops. You can't work alone. Writing itself is isolating, but once it's written, don't just let it sit there.
I agree. I love a writing retreat because you usually have some kind of interaction or class in the morning, and then you can write all afternoon, and then you get back together again. And it's most helpful to have that uninterrupted time away from your normal routine.
I agree.
Well, Mary Ann, tell us a little bit about the passage that you've brought to share today, and then read from it so that we can hear your tone and voice in the book.
Okay, well, I'm going to read a little bit from Handful of Pearls. And you know what the first line is. I learned to golf so I could smoke. Well, this is Betty, and she's trying to figure out how she can communicate with her middle-aged daughter going through the same kinds of trauma she was. And she decides to go through some of her old photos and write a journal. So that's the stage kind of we're at here now. So I put down my old photos for a moment and mindlessly render a quick sketch along the margin of my little book as I consider where to go from here. The drawing is supposed to be the long ago me done in quick lines and swirls. My pen returns to the lines of the page, but a glance at my high-class doodlings, as my husband Earl always called them, shows my granddaughter M, not a self-portrait. Really doesn't surprise me, as we do look a bit alike. My sweet M. Oh, dear Lord, I almost called her Reggie. I certainly shouldn't mix up those two. My daughter Reggie doesn't resemble me much, not like her daughter M does, not in looks or personality. Reggie is impulsive like her father. Reggie decided long ago she doesn't like me much. I hoped over the years she would come to me, but it never really happened. I'm a good listener, but she doesn't confide in me. But I'm still waiting and hoping. I guess I understand at least a little. I nearly destroyed her, or at least through my silence or negligence, call it what you will. I aided and abetted her predisposition to self-destruct. Maybe I can make it up somehow with this little book. Hopefully it will contain at least a couple of pearls of wisdom. Anyway, when I saw my granddaughter M yesterday, I really let her know how she looked with that fag. Yes, I know the meaning's changed, hanging off her lip. She promised to quit for sure this time. I believe her, even though she's the only grandchild that resembles me in the slightest, and I'm not talking about just the red hair. Not that either one of us is a liar saying yes when we know in our hearts we don't necessarily mean yes, but I know how to make people hear what they want to hear. That's always been true for me. I suspect it's true for her too. So back to St. Ingrid's. That's the girls' school. My friends and I would pull on our golf skirts and head for the links or dress up for town in a movie. One photo shows us standing like beauty queen contestants on the dormitory steps, right arms around our buddies' shoulders, left arms hanging gracefully. Miss Hartwig, our house mother, must have been in absentia that day, or we never would have gotten out without hats and gloves. As it is, there we are, frozen in time, summer dresses shifting in the light breeze, although the ripples in those pastel lawn dresses have since stiffened into black and white ridges, locked in place forever. Now when I look in the mirror, I no longer see a flaming redhead with Michelangelo marble skin, a complexion needing to be protected from freckling and burning in the sun. I am not the slender, straight-backed young girl in demure polka dots and lace, bracketed by best friends. No, by now all those lawn dresses have disappeared into some rag bag, if they're around anymore at all. Most likely, they disintegrated into colorless threads. So there you go, a little piece.
That's lovely, Mary Ann.
Thank you.
And doesn't that demonstrate so well the push and pull of mother-daughter relationships?
Yes, and it gets worse as the book goes on, of course, and she's got to try and figure out how to communicate. And I've found that a lot of the things I write are about family and communication and forgiveness and reconciliation.
That is so true. And your third book is coming out March 2023 for those listeners who are listening later. Tell us a little bit about that to advertise it.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Hannah's Eyes is about an 11-year-old girl. There she sits. And she steals her grandfather's spare glass eyeball, which is why I asked the designer to put an eye on the cover. And she holds it up and, thinks it will, she can see through it, but it takes her into this fairy world, as I said. And once she gets into the fairy world, she discovers all sorts of interesting things. The queen has stolen a little human boy, and that's why the king is mad at her, which is right out of Midsummer Night's Dream. And so there's this war going on, and Mother Nature is involved, and she comes in this great sweep of air and, things floating around. But Hannah and her friend Meg are trying to figure out how they can reconcile this king and queen. Meg gets kidnapped by the king, and Hannah has to try and get her back, and then still work on getting the two together. So it's a fun story. And my granddaughter was 11 at the time I wrote it, so it's an 11-year-old protagonist, and now she's 13, and the book is finally published. So you can see it takes a while to get things from being written to getting out in a printed form.
Well, it's such an intriguing story, and I love that you're carrying around that glass eye with you. And it is written for middle-aged students?
Middle grade students, yes. I've had second and third graders read it or have it read to them, and they like it. My granddaughter, who's now 13, still loves it. A grandson, actually, who's 10, has started it, and he said, Oma, this is pretty good. It's like high praise. So
it really is. And I think leaving a legacy for our grandchildren is just so wonderful. I had one of my granddaughters choose my book when they had to choose a book to read in her class. And she told everybody
wonderful.
Very proudly, my grandmother wrote this book. So that, thrilled me. So I know your grandchildren are going to do the same thing.
Yeah, that's such a good thing.
Do you have any other books in you?
Oh, yes. Years ago, I wrote a series of 3 books that are fantasy. I haven't pitched those yet, and probably won't for a couple of years, but they're sitting there. Like I say, I write manuscripts, and then they ferment for a while and come out hopefully like good wine, not vinegar. But I was just a 4th novel was just accepted by Black Rose, and it's called Water the Color of Slate. It will be out just before Christmas this year. And there is, again, reconciliation, forgiveness, misunderstandings in families. There are 2 generations. One, a great grandmother who lives in the late 1800s, who falls in love with a Ho-Chunk man, that's Native American, which of course in those years, and he with her, that's absolutely forbidden. So that's a huge conflict there. And then several generations later, her great granddaughter has to take in her own granddaughter because she's the only living relative left. So here is this grandmother in contemporary times and granddaughter, and they hate each other. So they start to discover that they both like history. They like local history. They like personal history. And so they start to research this Louise who lives back in the 1800s. They know who she is, but they don't know her full story. So again, the reader gets Louise in the past and Lou and Cappy in the present, and back and forth as they start doing research. And anybody that's done genealogy knows you can make incorrect conclusions about people in the past and what happened to them. So some of the things they come up with are true. Others the reader knows are not true. So that's been lots of fun to write.
And that's going to be a series?
That is just a single standalone. That's Water the Color of Slate. Unless I get going, there's a cat house in town, and this Louise in the back is friends with Juanita, who runs this for the ladies of the evening. And my writing group said, "Oh, we want to know what happened to Juanita. How did she get there?" So I have kind of a long short story that could be developed more about Juanita and And that was interesting to write because I had no idea. How did she get? I have no idea. Tell me, talk to me, Juanita, And she did. She told me all sorts of strange things. So that was fun. So who knows?
History and research can take us down so many interesting paths. And with the internet today, we can certainly figure out things. I did genealogy because I'm an adopted child, and I was always told I was Native American, and that's how I identify. And I found out instead I'm half Jewish.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
So you can find out all kinds of things when you do the research.
Yes. It can be fun or it can be daunting and disturbing, but it's fun.
Well, Mary Ann, as always, our last interview question is, our writers over 50 are quite unique. Do you have advice for writers 50 and above?
Yes, I do. Sit your buns down and put pencil to paper. That's the number one thing. Just write. And it doesn't matter what you write, because something will, like planting seeds in a garden, some of them die, some of them come up and then they die. Some of them come up and blossom. And so when you're writing, you never know what's going to happen. So sit down and write, and then join a group, get some, because they'll help you keep on track. They'll give you some feedback. They'll make you feel good about what you're doing. So there you go.
Well, Mary Ann, I think you're a perfect example of our authors over 50 who, I always say, it's never too late to write your first book. You're a perfect example of that. You've reinvented yourself in your retirement, and you're quite prolific and have many more books in you. So I just appreciate you being with us today and sharing your journey. And we are excited to say that we now count you among our authors over 50.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been wonderful talking to you.
Thank you for joining us today. Please look for Authors Over 50 every Thursday, when we will have conversations with accomplished debut novelists over the age of 50. Please subscribe and share with a friend. And check out my own publication journey after 50 at www.juliadaily, that's DAILY, like dailynewspaper.com. Until next time, keep reading and writing. And remember, it's never too late to fulfill a dream in life's sweetest third.